The rain slicked the grimy pavement of the alley behind St. Jude's Emergency, washing the smell of antiseptic into the street. Vionna Hale, her worn white nurse's uniform already speckled with the ordinary blood of a dozen minor trauma cases, pulled her collar higher. Her shift had ended 10 minutes ago, and her body was screaming for sleep, but the alley shortcut was unavoidable. That was when she saw him. A boy, impossibly small, dressed in clothes that looked like antique velvet, a deep, jarring red, was slumped against a cracked dumpster. His skin was the color of old porcelain, and a chilling metallic scent, far sharper than iron, hung in the air. Vionna dropped to her knees, her exhaustion dissolving into professional focus. His pulse was a ghost, his body temperature dangerously low. This wasn't a normal injury. This was poison. Vionna spotted the faint, purplish etching of an ancient sigil fading rapidly on his pale throat. She knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty only a healer could possess, that conventional aid wouldn't work. He would be dead before the ambulance arrived. Her eyes darted to the single, clean needle she kept pinned inside her jacket for emergencies. Time collapsed. Without thought, driven purely by the Hippocratic oath and a desperate, primal urge to save, Vionna pressed the needle deep into the vein of her own left forearm, dragging the point across the skin until a thick, perfect bead of her own blood formed. Her focus was absolute, the pale, lifeless mouth of the boy. A single drop of human life for an ancient, failing one. Just as the crimson bead trembled on the edge of her wrist, ready to fall, a shadow detached itself from the building. He was tall, intimidating, and radiating lethal intensity. Sylas Greymark, the Vampire King, his platinum blonde hair stark against the oppressive gloom, watched Vionna's act with eyes that were ancient ice, eyes that had just witnessed a human break every sacred law of their world to save his only son. Chapter 1. Vionna barely registered the sudden rush of movement. As the single drop of her blood disappeared onto Lysander's tongue, she felt a profound, invisible shift in the air, like a massive door closing somewhere far away. The boy's chest gave a small, ragged hitch, and a faint, almost imperceptible warmth returned to his skin. He was alive. The shadow that was Sylas Greymark moved, but not toward her. He snapped a command in a fluid, non-human language, and two figures in black, leather coats materialized from the darkness. They were fast, silent, and moved with a grace that negated physics. They lifted Lysander onto a specialized, padded stretcher that looked more like a cryopod. "You." Sylas's voice was a low, resonant baritone, laced with suspicion. His intense, icy blue eyes, the same shade as winter twilight, finally fixed on the nurse. Vionna still knelt in the puddle, her left forearm bleeding sluggishly from the deliberate cut. "You injected yourself into an affair that does not concern your kind." "He was dying," Vionna said flatly, pulling a sterile bandage from her pocket to press against the wound. Her exhaustion was returning in a crushing wave, but her medical training kept her defiant. "My kind, as you call it, saves lives." His pulse was undetectable until a moment ago. "He needs specialized care immediately." Sylas gave a short, humorless laugh. "Care? You delivered an ancient life force shock. You are not a doctor. You are a crude alchemist. And now you belong to me." Before she could protest, a pair of strong, cold hands lifted her bodily from the ground. She was deposited in a sleek, obsidian car next to the boy's pod. Lysander's frail hand, even unconscious, seemed to twitch slightly toward her. The journey was a blur of impossible speed, taking them through winding, hidden roads until they stopped before a structure that defied the night, the Greymark Castle. It was a fortress of black stone and ice, its spires disappearing into the cloud cover. Vionna was led through cavernous, silent halls, escorted by guards who moved like liquid smoke. They finally reached a massive chamber bathed in cold, silver light. At the far end, Upon a chair carved from obsidian sat Sylas Greymark. Now, in the full illumination, his appearance was breathtaking and terrifying. His platinum blonde hair was pulled back severely, accentuating cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, and his tailored suit looked like woven darkness. He was a monument of ruthless, aristocratic power. "Approach Vionna Hale," he commanded. Vionna walked forward, her blood-stained uniform the only splash of defiance in the perfect, silent room. She stopped a respectful but not submissive distance away. "You are human. You are weak. Yet, a single drop of your blood performed a miracle that saved the heir to my line from a venom older than the castle itself," Sylas stated, leaning forward, his gaze dissecting her. "That audacity, that power, is either extraordinary luck or a premeditated act of war. Which is it?" "It was neither," Vionna maintained, meeting his stare. "It was desperation. He was a patient in cardiac distress. I used the only available, compatible donor. Me. I'm a nurse. My intention was to save his life. Nothing more." "Humans do nothing for nothing, Hale," the Kim countered, his voice dripping with ancient suspicion. "You have forced yourself into my lineage, into my most private conflict. And until I understand why your blood possesses such unique vitality, you will remain here, under my protection and under my absolute authority." Vionna looked down at the small cut on her arm, now mostly clotted. She had risked everything for a stranger, and now that life had claimed hers in return. Chapter 2. Vionna was not granted the grace of rest. She was ushered from the king's presence by a small, wizened vampire whose robes smelled faintly of formaldehyde and old parchment. The examination room was unlike any hospital lab she had ever seen. Polished black marble tables held crystalline beakers and instruments made of carved bone and silver. She felt less like a patient and more like a specimen under glass. A team of physicians, all bearing the unsettling stillness of the undead, worked around her, drawing samples and murmuring in Latin and the same non-human language Sylas had used. They scrutinized her blood under what appeared to be enchanted glass lenses, their expressions oscillating between profound disdain and astonished fervor. The lead physician, Lord Varian, finally presented his findings to the king via a holographic projection in the castle's central observation hall, a space Vionna was intentionally placed near, not as an audience member, but as a subject of the report. "The toxicity levels of the iron-rot venom have stabilized, Your Majesty." Varian's voice was dry and formal. "The boy, Prince Lysander, has survived the acute phase. However, the venom is ancient, clinging to his core life force." He adjusted the projection, showing a vibrant red droplet, Vionna's blood, interacting with a sickly purple toxin on a slide. What the human, Hale, introduced was not merely fresh blood. It's an unprecedented counteragent. Her human vitality burns the poison on contact. It has the effect of a universal, regenerative antidote. A sharp silence descended. Vionna felt a chill deeper than the castle stone. Her common, working blood was now a miracle cure. She was not just a rescuer, she was a resource of infinite value. "The implication, Your Majesty," Varian continued, "is that the residual poison remains too virulent for traditional replenishment. To keep the prince stable, he requires constant, low-dose infusions of her specific blood. It will serve as both nutrient and ongoing antiviral. For the foreseeable future, Lysander's survival is contingent upon the proximity and cooperation of Vionna Hale." In a nearby private chamber, Vionna saw King Sylas standing rigidly, his back to the assembly. His platinum blonde hair seemed to absorb the silver light, making him appear inhumanly cold. His intense gaze was fixed on a crystal viewport showing Lysander sleeping in his pod. The boy was breathing steadily, but his hand was still reaching out to an empty space. Vionna was quickly assigned a small, elegant chamber adjacent to the prince's medical wing. As she was being led away, she passed the prince's pod. Lysander's eyes fluttered open for the briefest moment. They were not the ice blue of his father, but a strange, shifting gold. He didn't scream or panic. He simply looked at Vionna, and a silent, absolute recognition passed between them. Then, with a sigh, the boy closed his eyes again, stable, but utterly dependent. Vionna had earned her place in the cage. Chapter 3. Vionna's new life was a bizarre fusion of servitude and solitary confinement. Her days were spent in the twilight of the medical wing, tending to Lysander. She was dressed in plain, charcoal gray linens, but her nursing uniform was replaced by the constant, heavy awareness that she was now literally a life support system. A small, sterile pump, resembling an intricate silver cuff, was permanently affixed to her wrist, allowing for precise, micro-infusions of her blood directly into the prince's pod. The process was painless, but the psychological invasion was profound. When Lysander was fully awake, he remained eerily silent, the dark circles under his gold eyes speaking of pain and the strange venom that still clung to his system. He rarely spoke to anyone, especially his father, but when Vionna entered the room, the tension around him eased. He never asked for her blood, but he did ask for her stories, tales of the human world, of sirens, traffic, and the rush of crowds, the common details of life Sylas had sheltered him from. He would reach out, not for her hand, but for the sleeve of her garment, clinging to the texture. One evening, while Vionna was charting his vitals, Lysander whispered, his voice thin as silk, "When you are near, the cold doesn't sink so deep." It was a profound admission of dependence, a vulnerability that chipped away at Vionna's clinical detachment. She was supposed to be a resource, a cure, but she was becoming a necessity, a warmth in the king's cold world. Her unique status, however, did not go unnoticed by the permanent residents of the castle. As she passed through the secondary hallways, Vionna caught fragments of whispers, hisses that barely reached human ears. They spoke of the unclean human contaminating the heir's pure bloodline. One night, while retrieving sterile supplies near the great banquet hall, she overheard a conversation between two nobles in the deep shadow of an archway. "Lord Hale is furious," a female voice hissed, sharp as flint. "He says the king is growing weak, trusting a human with the heir's life. Lysander is tainted by that common blood, a walking disaster waiting to happen. If the boy dies, the throne weakens," the male voice responded, low and cynical. "But if the boy lives because of her, that's worse. It proves the king needs the weak. Hale will not allow this." The chill Vionna felt was no longer from the castle stone or the presence of the undead. It was the icy clarity of realizing she was a critical liability in a lethal, political game. She wasn't just guarding Lysander's body. She was guarding him, and herself, from the very court sworn to protect him. The air was thick with conspiracy, and Vionna was positioned directly at the emotional core of the king's greatest weakness. Chapter 4. Vionna had established a rhythm of hypervigilance. The sterile routine of Lysander's care, checking his silver cuff, adjusting the light filtering into his room, ensuring the antique velvet sheets were pristine, was a mask for the constant paranoia. She trusted the massive, impenetrable walls of the castle less than she trusted the exposed streets she used to walk. She knew the danger came from within. Tonight, the quiet was too heavy. Lysander was stirring, restless under the weight of the dark red fabric. Vionna moved to smooth the sheets, her fingers automatically sweeping the fine material for any foreign object. It was a habit born from years of bedside nursing. Always check the sheets, always feel for a misplaced clamp or a sharp edge. Her finger brushed something hard, cold, and impossibly thin, a piece of metal that felt wrong. Her adrenaline spiked instantly. Before her conscious mind could process what it was, her nurse's hand reflexively pinched the object, pulling it free from the heavy fold near Lysander's frail shoulder. It was a needle, long, delicate, and entirely non-surgical. It gleamed faintly in the dim light, not the dull sheen of steel, but the poisonous, pale white of silver. The tip was barely visible, having just started to break the skin of the boy's neck. A breath later, and the residual iron-rot venom would have combined with the silver, causing a lethal, catastrophic systemic shutdown. Vionna didn't scream. She clamped her hand around the needle and turned, her heart hammering a deafening rhythm. Her swift, silent movement drew the attention of the single guard posted by the door, a large, imposing vampire Vionna knew as Cashin. "What is it, human?" Cashin demanded, moving with startling speed. "Stand down," Vionna commanded, holding up the needle so the silver tip caught the light. "I found this." Cashin's face, usually impassive, contorted with a silent snarl. He didn't rush to the prince, he rushed Vionna. His intent was clear: destroy the evidence and silence the witness. Before Cashin could complete the 2 strides that would have broken Vionna's neck, a devastating force intervened. Sylas Greymark, who Vionna hadn't realized was observing from a secondary, concealed viewport, materialized in the room. He moved with a speed that blurred the air. There was no finesse, only righteous, terrible power. Cashin went sprawling against the stone wall, the impact echoing like a cannon shot. Sylas stood over his fallen guard, his platinum blonde hair slightly mussed, his aristocratic composure utterly shattered by a consuming, terrifying rage. "A silver delivery, Cashin," Sylas hissed, his voice so low it was almost subsonic, yet it vibrated in Vionna's bones. "You were meant to guard the door." Cashin, groaning, spat a response Vionna couldn't understand, a mix of defiance and venom. Sylas didn't wait for a translation. His eyes glowed like blue ice, and a crushing sound confirmed the guard's fate. The king turned to Vionna, who stood trembling, the silver needle still clutched in her hand. He didn't thank her. His gaze swept over the boy, over the needle, and finally rested on Vionna's steady, pale face. "A simple, stupid guard," Sylas muttered, more to himself than to her. "A direct attack from within meters of my son." He took the silver needle from her grasp, his fingers twitching as if suppressing the urge to turn the weapon on her. "You saw it before my enhanced senses did, Hale. Your mortal reflexes, your human vigilance, saved him where my millennia-old guards failed." The suspicion in his eyes did not vanish, but it was overlaid with a reluctant, burning realization. Vionna was not just a cure. She was a different kind of armor, a shield of quick, common humanity that his own ancient court was unable to penetrate or predict. The king needed her desperately, not just for her blood, but for her fear, her focus, and her simple, vital existence. Chapter 5. The incident with Cashin tore the veil of silence from the castle. The guard's ash remained on the floor as a grim warning, but the political fallout was immediate. Vionna found herself not back in the medical wing, but in the echoing hall of decrees, standing before the king and his inner council. They were all there, figures of immense, ancient power, draped in velvets and cold jewelry, their gazes dissecting her with predatory contempt. Leading the charge was Lord Hale, a vampire of monumental size with eyes like polished jade and a voice that held the booming authority of a military general. He stood immediately after Sylas, a clear threat to the throne's stability. "The king endangers the lineage." Hale's voice reverberated through the stone columns. "The presence of Vionna Hale is a blight. She attracts attack, she exposes our internal weakness, and her common blood taints the very essence of the air. She must be expelled or executed to preserve the sanctity of the Greymark line." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall. Vionna stood perfectly still, focusing on the sterile cuff on her wrist, keeping her fear locked down by professional discipline. Sylas, regal and deadly in his obsidian throne, met Hale's challenge with chilling composure. "Lord Hale," he stated, his voice a low, lethal purr. "The humans saved the prince when your best guards failed. She is not a blight. She is a shield whose composition you and your allies cannot predict. The prince lives because of her presence, not despite it. She is a risk, Sylas. Hale shot back, abandoning formality. She proves you rely on weakness. We cannot allow our future king to be dependent on a fragile, disposable human. Sylas's eyes narrowed to slivers of ice, and the air pressure in the room seemed to drop. He had defended Vionna, but Hale's words had found purchase among the court, forcing the king to make a definitive, political move. You raise valid points, Lord Hale, Sylas conceded, much to Vionna's shock. He was not yielding her, but he was acknowledging the political necessity. Dependence must be temporary. Therefore, I issue a new decree. He fixed his gaze on Vionna, the platinum blonde of his hair gleaming like silver against the dark throne. Vionna Hale, you have proven your ability to preserve life. Now, you will prove your value to our future. You are to immediately begin working with Lord Varian and the royal alchemists. Your assignment is singular. You will use your unique human blood, your medicinal knowledge, and the resources of this castle to devise a permanent, self-sustaining cure for the residual iron-rot venom within Lysander. The decision was a political masterstroke. It silenced Hale by addressing the need for independence and simultaneously cemented Vionna's role as the single most critical asset in the castle. Vionna spent her nights meticulously charting the effects of minute blood samples against various neutralizing agents, observing the crimson droplet of her life force fighting the remnants of the iron-rot venom under enchanted magnification. She quickly realized that the problem was not Lysander's weakness, but the nature of the poison itself. One night, Lord Varian, the lead physician, found her working long past the rotation shift. He was the least contemptuous of the alchemists, viewing Vionna with professional curiosity rather than hatred. He approached her workstation, his shadow long and thin. "You seek a synthesis, Nurse Hale," he murmured, observing her complex organic diagram. "But you treat the venom as a single compound. It is not." Vionna looked up, her exhaustion pulling at her eyes. "The analysis shows residual iron rot, but its half-life is too persistent. It's almost catalyzed." Varian leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "It is not merely iron rot. It is a custom blend, Hale. Only one other component possesses the necrotic persistence to achieve this effect, particularly when coupled with silver." He tapped a spot on Vionna's chart. "This is sunbane." Vionna recognized the name from a dusty volume she had managed to skim. A mythical toxin said to cause slow, systemic decay in ancient vampires. Sunbane? That's legend. It's extinct. Not extinct, Varian corrected, his eyes flickering toward the door. Merely contained. It was the signature weapon of the House of Varro, the Greymark's ancient blood rivals. They were decimated 3 centuries ago, eliminated for attempting to assassinate a previous king. Vionna's mind raced. If Varro was eliminated, who was using their signature weapon now? Someone revived the formula. Someone with access to their deepest archives. Varian nodded once, grimly. "And access to a high-ranking member of our current court. Lord Hale has been vocal, but he is a Greymark loyalist, even if he despises humans. He is too predictable. Someone is using the Varro poison to incite a coup, aiming to fracture the court's trust in Sylas and frame the hunters." Vionna understood the gravity immediately. The true threat wasn't a sudden attack, but a calculated, political war rooted in the past. Lysander was simply the medium, and Vionna was the key. She had been assigned to the alchemist's lab not merely to find a cure, but to expose the traitor who was working with the remnants of the king's ancient, mortal enemy. Chapter 7. The next night, a sealed, official summons arrived for Vionna, an emergency request for an immediate, high-volume blood draw to stabilize Lysander after a sudden crisis. The note was signed with Lord Varian's seal, but Vionna knew his meticulous hand. The penmanship was subtly rushed, the seal pressed too deep. This was allure. She followed the summons anyway. She knew that trying to evade it would only confirm her suspicion and likely accelerate their plan. She was guided not to the sterile medical wing, but to the castle's east tower, a secluded, rarely used wing dedicated to storing ancient relics. The air grew dense and cold, smelling of ozone and forgotten magic. The chamber was circular, dominated by a huge, empty granite basin, an ancient reservoir for rituals, not medicine. As Vionna stepped into the center, the heavy stone door slammed shut behind her, plunging the room into near-total darkness, relieved only by the faint, ominous glow of the moon through a narrow arrow slit. "Well done, human." A booming voice echoed from the shadows. Vionna turned, her heart beating a furious, human rhythm. Lord Hale emerged from the gloom, flanked by four massive, silent guards. His eyes, the jade color Vionna remembered, were now blazing with conviction. "There is no crisis," Hale said, stepping toward the granite basin. "Only opportunity. You've exposed the weakness of King Sylas, his sentimental reliance on things he cannot control." Vionna stood her ground. "You're trying to use Sunbane, a Vera weapon, to discredit the king and start a civil war. I know what the poison is." Hale laughed, a loud, disdainful sound that bounced off the stone. "Vera? That is a convenient fiction for the history books. We are simply those who refuse to see our future dictated by a mortal nursemaid. Your blood, Hale, is powerful. Too powerful for a mere commoner." He gestured to the basin. "You will provide us with the essence necessary to cure Lysander, on our terms, and then stabilize the court." Vionna realized the full scale of the betrayal. Hale wasn't just a disgruntled noble. He intended to seize the very source of Lysander's healing. "You mean weaponize it? You won't cure him. You'll just transfer his dependence to you. The boy will be fine eventually," Hale dismissed, his patience wearing thin. "But the court requires a king who is not beholden to a mortal. Sylas allows you to live, allows you to touch the air, allows you to contaminate our legacy. He is compromised. He is weak." Hale snapped his fingers. "Restrain her. We begin the harvest now." As the four guards moved toward her, Vionna pressed her back against the cold stone. She was trapped, cornered, and her unique, precious life force was about to be forcibly extracted to fuel a coup against the only vampire who had, however reluctantly, offered her protection. This was the true price of life in the castle. She was the key to the throne, and she had just been seized. Chapter 8. The four guards closed the gap with chilling efficiency, their cold hands reaching for Vionna's arms. She braced herself, ready to struggle, knowing her human strength was negligible against their speed. Lord Hale watched, a victorious, predatory smile stretching across his face, ready to witness the breaking of the king's newest possession. "The weak always yield to the strong. Hale," Hale gloated, stepping closer to the granite basin. "Your purpose is servitude, not autonomy." Just as the nearest guard clamped down on Vionna's shoulder, a sound sliced through the heavy, stale air, a thin, frantic, high-pitched scream. It didn't come from Vionna. It seemed to resonate from the very stone walls, vibrating with pain and pure, ancient, infant fury. The guards froze. Hale's smile dissolved into a look of confusion. The chamber's darkness was suddenly challenged by a brilliant, flickering light. Not the moon, but an energy source emanating from the narrow arrow slit high above. A small figure dropped silently from the opening, landing perfectly between Vionna and the conspirators. It was Lysander. He was fully dressed in his red velvet tunic, his small body rigid, his eyes wide open. But his eyes were no longer merely gold. They were molten, burning spheres of light, pouring raw, uncontrolled vampiric power into the room. A force field, visible only as a shimmering ripple of heat, exploded outward from a small frame, throwing the nearest guards back against the stone walls with painful force. "Leave her alone," Lysander shrieked, his voice amplified, echoing with the thunderous authority of centuries. He was trembling violently, his gold eyes struggling to contain the catastrophic power he was generating. Vionna understood instantly. He had sensed her distress across the castle, and the residual sunbane venom, combined with the shock of her blood, had prematurely awakened a devastating, untamed power meant to bloom over decades. Hale recovered first, his jade eyes narrowed with sudden terror. The boy is a monster. Kill him now. Hale lunged, but the power Lysander exerted was overwhelming. The air around the prince turned brittle. Hale was suspended mid-leap, his face contorting in silent agony as the nascent force held him motionless. Lysander was a beacon of pure energy, saving Vionna but destroying himself. Then the true sovereign arrived. The heavy door Vionna had entered threw splintered inward with the force of a battering ram. Sylas' Greymark was a streak of midnight blue and platinum white, moving faster than the eye could follow. He took in the scene, the frozen guards, the terrified Hale, and the small, blazing source of apocalyptic power that was his son, in a single, terrible moment. Lysander, stop! Sylas roared, rushing to his son. He didn't hesitate, wrapping his large frame around the small boy, absorbing the shockwave of raw energy. The power subsided instantly, plunging the room back into cold darkness. Lysander collapsed, unconscious, into his father's arms. Sylas set his son gently on the cold stone, then rose to his full, towering height. His eyes, fixed on Hale, were beyond rage. They were the icy certainty of absolute law. Hale, finally released from the energy field, was still shuddering. "Vero," Sylas stated simply, his voice low and devoid of humanity. "You used the poison of my ancient enemy to destroy my son, and you thought to steal the life of the human who saved him. You tried to weaken the crown, Lord Hale." Hale stammered a final, desperate challenge. "You are unfit, Sylas. You rely on—" He never finished the word. Sylas moved. A chilling, clean sound of separation echoed in the chamber. The great Lord Hale, the formidable rival, became nothing more than a sudden, silent collapse of fine fabrics onto the cold granite floor. Sylas didn't look back at the mess. He turned, retrieved his son, and walked toward Vionna, his authority reaffirmed in the most brutal, final display. He was the king, and the threat was over. Chapter 9. The aftermath was silent, the kind of stillness that follows a geological upheaval. Hale's ash was swept away, and the conspirators were imprisoned. The full weight of Sylas Greymark's authority descended on the court, heavy and cold. The threat to Lysander was neutralized, but the political wounds were deep. Vionna, exhausted and emotionally raw, was immediately ushered back to the medical wing. She administered the final, stabilizing dose of her blood to Lysander, her heart aching for the trauma the boy had endured and the uncontrollable, nascent power that now pulsed within him. This time, the infusion felt different, less like medicine, more like a seal. The next morning, Lysander woke fully recovered, the golden light in his eyes clear and steady, the sunbane venom finally purged. The king summoned Vionna to the Hall of Decrees one last time. It was a formal assembly, quieter than the first, but every pair of ancient eyes in the room was fixed on the human. Sylas stood before his throne, Lysander, pale but resolute, at his side. "The line is secure," Sylas announced, his voice carrying the finality of stone. "The conspiracy is broken, and the heir is restored, thanks to the vigilance of Vionna Hale." He paused, his icy blue gaze sweeping over the assembled nobles, challenging any whisper of dissent. "It is clear that the modern threats facing this line require protections unknown to our past. Therefore, I declare Vionna Hale to be the royal protector and chief healer to the heir. She is granted the highest level of sanctuary, accorded the status of my most trusted advisor, and any harm done to her will be considered treason against the crown. The declaration was shocking. Vionna was not dismissed. She was enshrined. Later that twilight, Vionna stood on a castle balcony, shedding the last of her gray servant clothes. In their place, she wore a tailored silk gown in a deep, midnight blue, gifted to her by the royal steward. It was utterly foreign to her, but it felt like armor. She watched the sun disappear over the distant, human city she had left behind. Sylas joined her, holding a still sleepy Lysander. The boy immediately shifted, reaching a small, warm hand for Vionna's arm, clinging instinctively. "Your contract is complete, Vionna Hale," Sylas said quietly, his gaze resting on his son. "Lysander is cured. I can grant you immunity, wealth, and transport you back to your life with all memory of this place sealed. You'll be safe." Vionna looked at the city lights, then down at the boy who was utterly dependent on her presence, and finally met the king's intensely vulnerable eyes. "My life was waiting tables and loneliness, Your Majesty. Here, I saved a life and exposed a 3-century-old conspiracy. I have found a purpose far greater than I ever imagined." She placed her hand gently over Lysander's. "He needs more than a cure, Sylas. He needs protection from himself, and a bridge to the human world he must one day rule. I accept my commission." Sylas studied her for a long moment, a ghost of approval softening his perfect, stern features. "Welcome to the family, then, Chief Healer. A dangerous one, forged in blood and betrayal." Vionna smiled, genuine and unafraid. "I'm a nurse, King Greymark. I specialized in danger." She placed a protective hand on Lysander's shoulder, securing her place beside the heir and the sovereign. Her life as a common human was over. Her story as the royal protector had just begun.